The family business is no longer in operation. $10,000 is your part. As alien and unintelligible as if they had been spoken in a different language, the words lingered in the air of my late husband's study. With my fingers still following the scuffed leather surface where Richard's fingertips had landed only weeks before, I glanced up from the old desk where he had worked for decades. "Oliver, I apologize." "Just what did you say?" Fortunately, my voice sounded more steady than I felt. At 68, I had mastered the art of remaining calm in the face of a failing world. I somehow made it through the burial in a state of sadness, followed by Richard's unexpected stroke 3 weeks ago, and now this. I couldn't quite make out my only son's countenance as he stood in front of me holding a document. "Mom, it's all here." Oliver, whose well-groomed fingernails stood in sharp contrast to the calluses his father had developed while starting Bradford Precision Technologies from scratch, passed the document across the desk. It may come as a surprise, but Dad had been weighing proposals for some months. It just so happened that after everything, the sale closed. I looked down at the paper. Surprisingly little information on a single page for something that claims to dissolve a $13 million firm. $10 million, I said slowly. After 45 years of marriage, your father and I developed a business for my portion of it. Oliver, straightening his Italian silk tie, a nervous tic he'd picked up in boarding school, emphasized, your share. Through the trust he set up years ago, Dad transferred his majority interest to me. Based solely on the sale price, this is the typical spousal compensation arrangement. The usual amount of spousal support. As like I were a mere worker receiving a meager severance pay instead of the woman who had supported Richard Bradford during 40 years of hardship, sacrifice, and eventual triumph. I understand. I spoke in a neutral, even inquisitive tone. And who is the purchaser? Another company in the aerospace industry? One of our rivals? Oliver was a quarter of a second too long. Monarch Holdings is a private investment group. Purchasing mid-sized manufacturing businesses is their area of expertise. I repeated, closely examining my son's expression, Monarch Holdings. Richard never brought them up, I think. The development was new. Oliver appeared to regain his confidence. In fact, they came to us right before Dad had his stroke. It's a bad time. However, the offer is good. They are keeping the majority of the employees and sustaining operations. Dad would have approved of it. Was it? Recalling Richard's hoarse whisper from one of his final moments of clarity in the hospital, I pondered. Tell me, Amelia, you'll keep everything we've built safe. There's a problem. I had at the time ascribed his worry to the bewilderment that stroke victims occasionally experience. I wasn't so sure now. When may I expect to meet the new proprietors? I asked, carefully folding the paper and tucking it into my cardigan pocket. Oliver blinked, obviously unprepared for this inquiry. Mom, you don't need that. I've taken care of everything. After you sign the payment acknowledgement, you can concentrate on adapting to your new situation, my new situation, widowhood, apparent poverty, and being cut off from the companionship that had been as much a part of who I was as my marriage. How thoughtful of my son to handle everything so well, only 3 days after we buried his father. I noted mildly that $10,000 won't go you very far. This residence alone has yearly property taxes that are almost that high. Oliver's face briefly flashed with something, annoyance, worry, before returning to its empathetic efficiency. We'll talk about your living situation shortly. It's a difficult estate. This payment will assist with immediate expenses for the time being. Slowly, as though thinking over what he had said, I nodded. What about the company's valuation? Given the defense contracts Richard was able to get last year, $13 million seems like a rather little sum. Oliver's eyes squinted a bit. You've never been involved in the business side of things, Mom, with all due respect. Current market conditions and some newly developed liabilities are reflected in the valuation. The dismissal I had expected was there. Amelia was a poor, indifferent corporate wife who planned charity events and dinner parties while the guys took care of the important things. How ignorant they were. Naturally, I gave in, getting out of the chair with the dignity that had grown to be my shield after decades of being undervalued. You're correct. Your father was always in charge of business, not me. Oliver's face showed signs of relief. Maybe he had expected tears or perplexed inquiries. Not this serene acceptance. Mom, I'm happy you get it. Everyone benefits from this. Tomorrow, the check will be transferred straight into your account. How practical. I indicated that our chat was coming to an end on my terms rather than his by moving toward the door. Oliver, too? Who is the real owner of Monarch Holdings? If nothing else, I want to know who now owns your father's legacy. In a well-practiced response, someone who had foreseen this question said, "It's a private investment consortium." Very professional and discreet. Elizabeth Windsor serves as their managing director. I think it's British. The slight smile that tugged at the corners of my mouth was unavoidable. Windsor, Elizabeth? How fascinating. Do you know who she is? Oliver inquired, his tone suddenly becoming cautious. With my hand now on the doorknob, I responded, the name sounds vaguely familiar. Oliver, I appreciate you taking care of things. You've always worked so well. When he was gone, I went back to Richard's desk and took out a slim leather portfolio from the secret drawer that only he and I knew about. A comprehensive dossier about Monarch Holdings, including its tax returns, incorporation paperwork, and sole shareholder name, was contained within. Blackwood, Amelia Elizabeth. Windsor had been my maiden name. I used my no longer trembling fingertips to trace the exquisite letterhead. The business that I had covertly started 6 months prior when Richard first expressed his concerns over our son's financial shenanigans. Oliver had so kindly supplied the buyer's representatives with fictitious valuation documents, which allowed the company to acquire Bradford Precision Technologies for a fraction of its true value. I was startled out of my reverie by the ringing phone. Jonathan Mercer, my husband's longtime lawyer, was phoning just on time. Without introducing himself, he inquired, "Is it done?" Yes, I did confirm. I was just told about the transaction by Oliver. He offered me $10,000 for my share, exactly as you had anticipated. Jonathan laughed without a sense of humor. Did he also identify the buyer? Apparently, Elizabeth Windsor is the owner of Monarch Holdings. Yes, and did he understand what the term meant? No. I responded, glancing at the wedding photo on Richard's desk, which showed me beaming and young in ivory lace next to my intelligent, driven husband. He just sold his father's business to his mother, but he doesn't realize it. Jonathan reminded me that the board meeting is on Friday. We have 3 days to get ready. Amelia, are you prepared for this? There's no turning back once we start. Richard's last frantic whisper came to mind. Of 45 years creating something significant. Of my son's casual rejection of my part in it all. My whole life, I've been prepared for this, I answered. Oliver simply isn't aware of it yet. I gave myself a moment of hesitation as I hung up. Really, was I ready to face my only child? To destroy the meticulously crafted deception he had created? To enter the harsh light of corporate dominance and emerge from the shadows? Richard's voice was as clear as if he were standing next to me as he answered. Amelia, show them your true self. I've always seen this woman, show them. Now was the moment to do just that. Make sure to subscribe if this tale of treachery and hidden power has captivated you. What has Oliver been up to with the family business, exactly? And when he finds out who is actually in charge of Monarch Holdings, what will happen? The game is just getting started. The thick leather and mahogany of Richard's study stood in sharp contrast to Jonathan Mercer's office. With its steel, glass, and contemporary angles, it was a clear and uncompromising reflection of the lawyer's pragmatic outlook on life. Since Jonathan was a recently graduated lawyer managing Richard's first big contract discussions, I had known him for almost 40 years. You appear extremely calm for someone who recently learned that her son tried to defraud her of millions of dollars. Sliding a cup of tea across his desk, he watched. I took the cup and said, "Appearances are deceiving, Jonathan. Oliver seems to have forgotten something. The lawyer took a modern tablet out of his drawer and nodded. The documentation for the board meeting on Friday is complete. We'll have to act fast after you're formally announced as Monarch Holdings owner. Oliver will definitely try to contest the purchase. For what reasons? Even though I knew the answer, I still asked. For months, we had been preparing this countermove. Reduced capacity, probably. Jonathan's face grew a little softer. He will assert that you were not mentally competent when Richard passed away and that I, or other outside forces, had persuaded you to take over the business. The sour laugh that came out of me was unavoidable. The identical argument he was about to make if Richard had lived long enough to confront him about the missing money was diminished capacity. Exactly. When Jonathan tapped the tablet, a number of intricate financial spreadsheets appeared. In relation to that, our forensic accountants have finished their investigation. It's more serious than we thought. I made myself steely. Show me. For the hour that follows, Jonathan carefully went over the proof of my son's treachery with me. Fabricated reports on inventory. Unidentified payments from competitors are being made to offshore accounts. Oliver himself was the owner of patents that were sold to shell corporations for market value but could be tracked down through layers of corporate obfuscation. Jonathan came to the conclusion that he had been methodically destroying the business for at least 3 years. He would have a remarkable memory for numbers if he hadn't noticed the disparities in the quarterly reports last year, I said quietly. Even when he seemed to be indifferent to the specifics during board meetings, a quality our son had reportedly undervalued in both of his parents. Pulling up another page, Jonathan added, the employee pension fund is the most egregious issue. Oliver has been taking out personal loans with it as collateral. When the fund eventually failed, those employees would have lost everything if we hadn't stopped the sale to his shell firm. With conscious control, I put down my teacup, battling the surge of disappointment and rage that threatened to overpower my well-preserved calm. These weren't only spreadsheet figures. They represented the retirement funds of individuals who had collaborated with Richard for many years, who had been present at our Christmas gatherings, whose children had been recommended to college by us, and whose significant life events had been commemorated with gifts and cards. Does he really think that he would have escaped punishment for this? More to myself than to Jonathan, I inquired. According to the lawyer, financial fraudsters usually have 2 traits in common. Extraordinary self-confidence in their cunning and a resolute belief that the rules only apply to other people. He snapped the iPad shut firmly. Oliver has each of them in spades. Recalling Richard's tense relationship with his own father, a guy whose gambling addiction had all but destroyed the family before his son was even born, I whispered that he was just like his grandfather. Jonathan gave a solemn nod. The board convenes on Friday morning at 10. Oliver anticipates introducing the new Monarch Holdings ownership group, particularly the enigmatic Elizabeth Windsor, with whom he thinks he has been negotiating through middlemen. And he'll get me instead. I smooth my dress, a tense childhood habit that comes back when things get stressful. How about the members of the board? Are they reliable? Henderson and Patterson are both securely in Oliver's pocket. His schemes have directly benefited them. The others are either totally unaware of Richard's remembrance or devoted to it. A folder was slid across the desk by Jonathan. Each member's dossier is included, along with our knowledge of their involvement, or lack thereof. I took the folder. The enormity of what we were doing hit us hard. What about the staff? When this is made public, how can we safeguard them? The operational side of the company is protected from any legal ramifications by the acquisition structure. Through Monarch, your controlling interest guarantees continuous production. After a moment of hesitation, Jonathan said, but there will be questions. Shock, perhaps rage at the whole Blackwood family, Amelia. Considering the pension fund and the families that relied on it, I responded that it was better to be temporarily angry than to be permanently impoverished. Richard founded this business on honesty and creativity. I refused to let Oliver's avarice and shortcuts to ruin that heritage. Jonathan asked the question he had been tactfully avoiding during our discussion as I was packing to depart. What about after Friday? Have you made a decision regarding Oliver's fate? The moral need to hold my child accountable clashed with my maternal impulse to protect him. I imagined Oliver as a young child, sincerely describing his Lego constructions as a teenager. Stumbling through his first school dance. Where had that youngster gone when he was a young man, standing tall and proud in his graduation robes, Richard grinning at his side? At what point had ambition turned into greed? That depends on him, I said at last. On whether he is capable of facing his actions with candor and regret. Jonathan only nodded, although his face said he had serious misgivings about that. I'll arrange for a car to come get you on Friday at 9 o'clock. Before then, try to get some sleep. Get some rest. As if it were possible to sleep with the threat of Friday's clash hanging over them. As though I could close my eyes and not remember Richard's face from those last few days in the hospital. His face twisted in an attempt to convey what he had learned about our son. When I checked my phone in Jonathan's building lobby, I discovered 3 missed calls from Oliver and a text message. We must talk about the house. Are you able to meet tomorrow? The real estate agent has a few inquiries. The real estate broker. As though our house, where Richard and I had brought him up, where we had celebrated holidays and birthdays, where my husband had passed away, was simply another property to be sold. I typed a brief response. Of course. The study of your father. 2 p.m. I thought, let him come to me. Let him sit in his father's chair and openly tell me that he intended to sell the house for a pittance below the actual value of the business. The power dynamic he had always assumed, the informed son running his father's affairs while his mother obediently took whatever scraps he dared to offer, would be our final chat. That dynamic would break irreparably on Friday. The only thing left to wonder was if our bond as mother and son would break with it. I was reminiscing about an early talk I had with Richard as my driver negotiated the afternoon gridlock. I had recently graduated with honors from my finance degree, while balancing coursework with taking care of Oliver, who was still a baby. Richard had watched me go over his company's first real investment proposal and had noted that you could be a formidable force in the business world, Amelia. You spot trends and flaws that I completely overlook. Distracted by the mistakes I was discovering in the potential partner's valuation methodology, I had said, perhaps someday. However, Oliver needs me right now, and the company needs you full-time. Just promise me something, Richard had asked, taking my careful notes and the proposal. Don't let that sharp financial intellect remain dormant indefinitely. There are enough homemakers in the world. There is not enough Amelia Blackwoods in it. I was finally keeping that promise 45 years later, and Oliver was about to learn that his mother had been watching closely the entire time. Being on time was one of the few qualities Oliver truly received from his father, and he arrived at exactly 2:00 p.m. He wasn't by himself. He was accompanied by a svelte woman in her mid-30s, who was instantly recognized as the estate agent by her well-tailored suit and sly smile before any introductions were made. Oliver greeted the woman with a hand at the small of her back, a move too familiar for a simple business acquaintance, and added, "Mom, this is Vanessa Hargrove from Prestige Properties. This is one of the opulent estates she specialized in." With the polished poise of a woman who had organized hundreds of business gatherings, I extended my hand. I didn't realize we had already moved on to using real estate services, Miss Hargrove. Vanessa's expression briefly changed to one of bewilderment as she looked at Oliver. Mr. Blackwood informed me that you had consented to list the property right away. Did you? I looked at my kid, whose eyes tightened slightly, but otherwise his face stayed deliberately neutral. How considerate of him to arrange these things while we were in mourning. Oliver cleared his throat. We talked about this, Mom. The house is too big for you to handle by yourself, and did we talk about the upkeep? I gently interrupted. I don't remember that discussion. Maybe you told me that my portion of your father's business was scheduled for a while later. Our business was only worth $10,000. As she felt the undercurrents, Vanessa's eyes widened slightly at the person and darted between us. Oliver's smile never left his lips, but it stopped short of his eyes. I proposed that Miss Hargrove wait in the living room while we worked out some family issues. It was obvious from my tone that this wasn't a request. After Vanessa had stepped back and shut the study door, Oliver's meticulously crafted facade fell apart. Mom, really? You have to confront her about the settlement? Like a strange morsel, I tested the word again, settlement. Is that the new name for it? Not pilfering? Not deception? He abruptly sank into Richard's leather chair without being invited, saying, "That's totally unfair. Independent analysts carried out the company's value. Taking into account the current liabilities, the offer constituted fair market value. I observed that liabilities that arose unexpectedly while you were in charge of remained in place." How practical. Oliver's face hardened into something I could hardly recognize, a calculating coldness that was nothing like the boy I'd reared. "Mom, I don't expect you to be an expert in complicated business finance. For decades, Dad shielded you from the harsh realities of business." I repeated, protected me, or excluded me. "Don't you believe the distinction is important?" Oliver stated dismissively, "This isn't productive. The business has been sold. To resolve unresolved estate matters, the residence must be liquidated. I've located a beautiful assisted living facility close to Charlotte." "Where is Charlotte?" I was unable to control my surprise. "I'm 6 hours from everyone and everything I know. It's not available to everyone. Lovely grounds. Amenities for full service." Instead of banishing his mother to a facility hundreds of miles away from her home, he talked as though he were speaking of an upscale hotel. "You may easily live there for years with the money you make from this place." The boy who had once crawled into my lap during thunderstorms, the teenager who had called me first when he was accepted to Princeton, the young man who had sobbed openly at his wedding while Richard and I looked on with pride, I looked at my son's face, looking for any sign of the child I had raised. Front row. Rather, all I saw was a stranger with my son's looks, weighing the square footage of the house where he had grown up against the value of my remaining years. With a calm voice despite the pain in my chest, I asked, "And if I decline this generous arrangement, do I prefer to remain in my home of 40 years? Oliver let out an overly patient sigh. "Be sensible, Mom. Dad's estate includes this house. The executor is me. In actuality, these choices are not optional." "I understand." As Oliver played on the lawn, I walked up to the window and looked out at the garden where Richard and I had spent many Sunday mornings discussing our future plans over coffee. "And in this equation, my preferences mean nothing?" He responded, using business language that further distanced us, "Your emotional attachment to this property isn't a factor in estate management. Buyers are already interested in Vanessa. In 30 days, we may close." Something inside of me was changing irrevocably as I turned back to him. The instinct to protect him from repercussions and to justify his actions, the last vestiges of parental protection, eventually broke. "No," I answered plainly. Oliver blinked, obviously unprepared to face up against someone. "No, I will not be relocating to Charlotte, I will not sell this house, and I do not approve of the way you have handled your father's estate." His astonishment soon turned to annoyance. "You don't really have a choice here, Mom," he said. "The legal documents are unambiguous." "As executor." "Yes," I interrupted, "executor. Not the only heir. Not the only proprietor. Did you only read the portions of Richard's will that gave you authority, or did you read it all?" His features flashed with uncertainty. "I read it, of course. With provisions for your care, the estate is transferred to me. I gently corrected you, under some circumstances, the estate is held in trust with you as executor. Getting my written approval before selling any real estate is one of those requirements." Oliver's face changed from bewilderment to incredulity. "That isn't feasible. Peterson went over everything. I provided Jeffrey Peterson. Not your father's lawyer, but your own. A difference that seems to be becoming more and more important." Taking a key out of my pocket, I went over to Richard's desk and opened the top drawer. I pulled a leather-bound document with Mercer and Associates letterhead from it. "Oliver, this isn't the synopsis Mr. Peterson gave you, this is the will." My son's face was pale as he gazed at the document. "Where did you purchase that?" "From your father, who told me exactly where to look for it and when to bring it in." Between us, I set the will on the desk. It appears that Richard was quite correct in his worries regarding how his affairs would be managed after his passing. I put my hand firmly on top of the document, but Oliver reached for it. It is expressly forbidden to sell this property without my written consent under Section 14, Paragraph C. Regardless of any estate concerns, Paragraph D states that my residency cannot be terminated without my consent. This isn't allowed. More to himself than to me, Oliver mumbled. Everything was altered by Dad before we could. Realizing he was on the verge of admitting, he stopped suddenly. What could you do before? Quietly, I asked. Before you were able to finish the company's asset transfer? In order for you to take my name off the property deeds? Before your dad knew exactly what was going on right in front of him? Oliver got to his feet so abruptly that the chair tumbled back and hit the bookshelf. You don't know what you're discussing. By the end, Dad was perplexed. Accusing and identifying issues where none existed. Was he? Under my placid appearance, a torrent of emotions was brewing, yet I managed to keep my voice quiet. Maybe we ought to talk about those charges at the board meeting on Friday. I think you're presenting the executive team to Bradford Precision Technologies' new shareholders. Oliver's attitude changed from protective rage to cautious calculation, suggesting that something in my tone must have alerted him. Regarding the board meeting, what do you know? Just what a knowledgeable shareholder would be aware of. I gave a small smile. However, in my instance, a shareholder's stake was reportedly only worth $10,000, which is far less than what one would anticipate for a $13 million corporation. Do you not agree? You're upset, Mom. People who are grieving may become paranoid. Oliver, see conspiracies, not paranoia. Clarity. I walked over to the door. Miss Hargrove has waited long enough, in my opinion. Tell her that the house won't be sold after all, please. This isn't over, he said quietly. You don't know what you're getting into. Quite the opposite, I said, opening the door. I know exactly what I'm doing for the first time in decades. I'll see you at the board meeting on Friday. When you talk to Elizabeth Windsor, please give her my respects. I gave myself a silent moment of delight as Oliver and a visibly bewildered Vanessa left. What Jonathan and I suspected was verified by the look of amazement in my son's eyes when I brought up Elizabeth Windsor, the fake owner of Monarch Holdings. Oliver never had the time to look into the business that was buying Bradford Precision Technologies. He was too rushed and greedy to do even the most basic due diligence. I went back to Richard's desk and traced the outline of his youthful face through the glass of our wedding photo. I muttered to his picture, the first move is complete. Though he is unaware of what is about to happen, he has a suspicion that something is off. Oliver would find out in 2 days just who he had been haggling with for months. Perhaps most cruelly, he would come to realize that Richard had known everything and that his mother was not the ornamental business wife he had written off, but rather a woman with the intelligence and will to defend what was important, even from her own son. Jonathan called me Thursday morning to let me know that he has been asking questions. Urgent ones. Yesterday afternoon, the Monarch Holdings headquarters received 3 calls. Several requests were made to speak with Elizabeth Windsor directly. Standing at the kitchen window, where the garden was lighted by the wan spring sunlight, I sipped my tea. Richard's beloved roses were starting to open, serving as a reminder that despite human drama, life went on with its cycles. How did he get a response? Just how we had intended. The service handled his calls expertly, assuring him that Ms. Windsor is on the road but is excited to meet everyone at the board introduction tomorrow. There was a sense of satisfaction in Jonathan's voice. Additionally, he made contact with 3 other estate litigation legal companies. Swiftly, I noticed. He is aware that something is off, but he is unsure of what. Specifically, he's scurrying aimlessly. Jonathan hesitated. Are you sure you want to follow through on this, Amelia? There's no going back once tomorrow's gathering starts. Despite all, I hesitated at the question. I still had Oliver as my son, the infant I had nursed through chicken pox and colic, the youngster whose nightmares I had calmed, the young man whose graduation had made me feel so proud that my chest hurt. However, he was also the grown-up who had consistently violated his father's confidence. Who tried to steal from devoted workers, who were willing to pay a minimal amount from a corporation worth millions of dollars to transport his mother to an assisted care facility 6 hours away. "I'm positive," I said, maintaining a steady tone. "When are you going to pick me up tomorrow?" I hung up the phone and headed for Richard's study, drawn there as I had been each day since his passing. His presence was still so palpable in the room that occasionally I thought I could hear his fingers tapping on the computer and smell the subtle bergamot of his favorite tea. I opened my laptop and took a seat at his desk. It was a powerful machine Richard had insisted I keep apart from the family network, not the family computer Oliver thought I used only to see pictures of my grandchildren and recipe websites. He had winked when he used the term operational security, but I had felt he was being overly dramatic at the moment. His foresight made sense to me now. Oliver was unaware that I had a private, secure email server. Or that Richard and I had spent years discussing business issues over encrypted channels. He surely didn't think that long before his health started to deteriorate, his father had given me administrative access to Bradford Precision's internal systems. I started looking at the most recent activities after logging in with credentials Oliver was unaware existed. He had been furiously examining paperwork, ownership documents, financial information, and board minutes from the previous 5 years since our confrontation yesterday. Most worryingly, he had obtained the whole employee stock ownership plan documentation, paying particular attention to the legal procedures that may be used to dissolve those holdings. A text from an unknown number rang on my phone. "This is Marcus Torres from the engineering division of Bradford Precision, Mrs. Blackwood. Our project files are exhibiting an odd behavior. Can we have a private conversation?" Marcus progressed from junior mechanic to head of special projects throughout his nearly 2 decades with the organization. Richard had frequently talked about his impeccable ethics and outstanding design work. I said right away, "Of course. Do you have permission to visit the house?" "4 p.m. He answered quickly. "We'll be there." "Thank you." At exactly 4 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Marcus looked just how I remembered him from business events. He was of medium height, had a trim physique, and had grown a salt and pepper beard after his wife made fun of him for being too young to be taken seriously. But his countenance was strange, a mix of determination and worry that spoke a lot about his present mental condition. "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Blackwood," he said as I led him into Richard's study. There was nowhere else for me to go. "Call me Amelia, please," I said, pointing to the visitor's chair. "You were always very highly regarded by Richard. I appreciate you getting in touch." With his hands clenched in his lap, Marcus sat rigidly. "I wouldn't bring you into business affairs, particularly so soon after Mr. Blackwood's death, but this is a first." I softly asked, "I assume it has to do with the company sale." Tension was visible in every muscle in his body as he nodded. "We were notified by the department yesterday afternoon that by the end of Friday, all material pertaining to proprietary technology must be uploaded to a new, secure site. Oliver gave the order, which was marked as the top priority." I noticed that the timing, right before revealing new ownership, seemed odd. "Mrs. Amelia, it's not just unusual. It's concerning." Even though we were the only ones in the house, Marcus leaned forward and spoke softly. "The destination is not our usual backup system, and the transfer methods do not adhere to our security criteria. It's a minimally encrypted remote server." I gasped. "Intellectual property is being extracted by him." Marcus's eyes grew wide at my instant understanding. "You know what this means?" "I think so." Even though I was getting angry, I spoke calmly. "Before the ownership transfer is finalized, he is getting ready to transfer Bradford's most valuable assets, your designs, patents, and unique processes, to a different company." "That's right." Marcus's face lit up with relief at being understood. "Everything that adds value to the business would be lost, leaving only vacant buildings and equipment. The real value, the intellectual property, would be under control elsewhere. I assume by Oliver." The scheme's audacity was astounding. Oliver was not satisfied with taking my share and undervaluing the business. He now intended to destroy Bradford Precision's most valuable assets prior to the formal sale to Monarch Holdings. To me. When was this directive issued? With implications running through my head, I asked. The afternoon of yesterday. Marcus paused. The timestamp indicates that Oliver departed your house shortly after that. That was his backup plan, then. He would just steal the intellectual property that made Bradford Precision what it was, if he couldn't use the law to take control of the estate and business. Have you started the transfers yet? I inquired. Marcus straightened, his stance displaying a sense of professional confidence. No. I reported system incompatibilities that needed to be fixed and implemented a technical delay. We have until tomorrow afternoon thanks to that. Us? I asked. The main group of engineers. His face grew stern. Mrs. Blackwood, we've been working with your husband for decades. We are aware that something is amiss. Oliver provided us with valuation figures that don't align with our project portfolios. There are inconsistencies in the pension fund reports. And now, this hasty disclosure of confidential data. I realized you've been watching all along. Marcus added plainly, Rich treated us like family. While his business is being decimated, we owe him better than to remain silent. Family. I was surprised by the intensity of the words. These workers had been silently protecting his father's legacy while Oliver, his real family, had been methodically betraying it. I made the snap choice to trust this man, whom Richard had greatly admired, and added, Marcus, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential until tomorrow's board meeting. Oliver is unaware of the identity of the company behind Monarch Holdings, despite the fact that the sale is legal. His forehead wrinkled in perplexity. I don't get it. My name is Monarch Holdings, I said plainly. My maiden name is Elizabeth Windsor. Richard first suspected financial issues 6 months ago, at which point I founded the business. Marcus gazed at me, his astonishment giving way to what appeared to be a remarkable sense of delight. You bought the business? From Oliver? Yes, based on the proof of financial fraud that he himself presented to my representatives throughout the discussions. A gradual grin appeared on Marcus's face. This would have delighted Richard. I verified that he was involved in its design. Marcus shook his head in amazement before his stroke rendered speech impossible. What can I do for you? Postpone the transfer of intellectual property without causing suspicion. New security procedures will be put into effect right away following tomorrow's board meeting. I stopped, thinking. And with regards to these erratic instructions, I might require your testimony. Without hesitation, he said, you'll have it. The engineering department as a whole will support you. All we've been waiting for is a companion. I spent a considerable amount of time in Richard's chair after Marcus left, taking in this most recent development. Oliver's actions were growing more rash, his desperation growing. The covert business scam had turned into outright larceny. Nothing could be more imminent than tomorrow. My phone rang. Jonathan once more. Without introducing himself, he added, we might have a problem. 2 hours prior to the scheduled meeting, at 8 a.m. tomorrow, Oliver has scheduled an urgent pre-meeting with a few board members. I assumed that Henderson and Patterson were identifying Oliver's supporters on the board. Grimly, Jonathan said, and Westfield. The last say in any emergency measures. The ramifications were obvious. By postponing the sale, removing intellectual property from the deal, or, worst of all, using a seldom-used clause to declare me unfit to own shares owing to purported cognitive impairment, Oliver was trying to get board approval for emergency measures. With my thoughts running through possibilities, I added, we need to get ahead of this. When does the building open for business? 7, Jonathan said. At 6:30, security shows up. Then, at 6:15, we will arrive. I made up my mind. Elizabeth Windsor should make an early appearance, in my opinion. With its steel and glass front sparkling gold in the early morning light, the Bradford Precision Technologies headquarters towered 15 floors over the nearby industrial park. 12 years ago, Richard had supervised every aspect of its construction, demanding a design that, like the company's products, struck a balance between contemporary efficiency and subtle references to old workmanship. Blackwood, Mrs. When Jonathan and I walked into the lobby at exactly 6:17 a.m., the night security guy was clearly taken aback. We didn't anticipate you. I said, "Hello, George," pleased to recall his name from the company's Christmas parties. Too much time has passed. Yes, ma'am, it has. My sincerest sympathies regarding Mr. Blackwood. There was genuine sadness on his face. He was a decent man. I always recalled the names of my children. Thank you. I nodded politely, accepting his pity. I think my son has arranged for board members to meet early. We want to have the main meeting room ready. George made no sign that he thought this request was out of the ordinary. Yes, ma'am. 15th floor. I'll let security know you're here. Jonathan went over our plan one last time as the elevator rose. First to arrive, perhaps by 7:30, will be Henderson and Patterson. Before Westfield shows up at 8, Oliver will give them a briefing. Before any of them show up, we must settle into the boardroom. The materials I verified included the Monarch Holdings acquisition documentation that showed you were the sole owner, Jonathan patting his leather bag, full dossiers on the financial anomalies, the phony company valuation, Oliver's attempt to seize the intellectual property, and more. I hadn't been to the executive floor since the company's 10th anniversary celebration 3 years prior, but the elevator doors opened onto it. Not much had changed. The same wall of glass gazing down on the industrial facilities, the same subdued gray carpet, the same beautiful artwork showing aerospace innovations throughout history. With its 20-foot mahogany table shining under recessed lighting, the boardroom took up much of the eastern side of the floor. Larger than the rest and at the head of the table, Richard's chair had been empty since his stroke 8 months ago. Marcus claims that Oliver had never assumed the right-hand seat, which is customarily occupied by the president of the company, during meetings. Where do I sit? As we walked into the empty room, I questioned Jonathan. After weighing his alternatives, he pointed to Richard's chair. There. It conveys the most lucid message. I paused, the symbolism suddenly overwhelming me. In addition to legal power, taking Richard's place meant assuming the leadership role that he had so effortlessly worn for decades. Jonathan, seeing my uncertainty, whispered softly, "It's what he would want, Amelia. He won't be replaced by you. You're defending his creation." I inhaled deeply before settling into the high-backed leather chair and organizing the supplies Jonathan had given me in a tidy stack in front of me. From here, I could see the elevator bank and reception room via the glass wall. When the others arrived, we would be able to see them well. Henderson and Patterson were deep in conversation when the elevator doors opened at 7:26 a.m. Both men halted for a second when they saw Jonathan, who was arranging paperwork on the table and could be seen clearly through the boardroom's glass wall. "Just on time," I whispered. The door to the boardroom opened a minute later as Henderson. Patterson followed closely behind a florid man who had the overfed appearance of someone who had eaten too many expense account meals. Mercer and Henderson looked at Jonathan with scarcely disguised animosity, then at me with visibly shocked eyes. "Mrs. Blackwood, you're not expecting this." "Good morning," I said cordially, "Robert." "Come on, Thomas." After exchanging uncomfortable looks, the men sat down as far away from me as the table would permit. With his thin face pinched with nervousness, Patterson added, "I don't think there's a board meeting scheduled until 10. Maybe there was some misunderstanding?" "No misunderstanding. I gave him my word. I am aware that Oliver set up a pre-meeting with you in Westfield at 8 o'clock. I just figured we might talk about something else first." Henderson's face turned from pink to scarlet. "With all due respect, the business of Mrs. Blackwood's company is currently somewhat delicate. Perhaps it would be better if the main shareholder weren't there for discussions regarding the company's future." I disagreed, but I did so in a mildly strong manner. Patterson reiterated, clearly confused, "Majority shareholder. However, the Monarch Holdings sale?" I verified that everything is going according to plan. "Maybe not, though, as Oliver told you." The elevator doors opened again, revealing my son before either man could reply. I could see the instant he noticed me in the boardroom, even through the glass. In a matter of seconds, his step stuttered, his face changing from one of assurance to one of shock, then to a measured recovery. His professional mask was securely in place when he walked into the boardroom, but his internal conflict was evident from the tiny quiver in his hands as he put down his briefcase. "Mom." He gave me a phony friendly greeting. "This is not what was intended. I didn't think you would come here, but the grief counselor said you would look for regularity and familiar surroundings." Anger that I carefully repressed was sparked by the condescending suggestion that my judgment had been impaired by grief, a foreshadowing of the decreased capacity argument Jonathan had foreseen. "How considerate of you to care about my mental health," I said calmly. "I'm thinking very clearly, I promise." Oliver looked from me to Jonathan and back again. "We always appreciate your presence, but we have a private business meeting planned. Could Jonathan take you home so we can talk later today?" "In fact," I said, "this appears to be the ideal time to openly handle several commercial issues, especially those pertaining to Monarch Holdings and the upcoming ownership transfer." Oliver's expression briefly changed to one of alarm, but he quickly covered it up with a patronizing grin. "I know you're concerned about the transaction, Mom, but the owner of Monarch Holdings should be well versed in these complicated business issues." "For him," I completed. "Do you not agree?" When I finished speaking, the boardroom fell silent. Oliver looked at me with calculating eyes, while Henderson and Patterson exchanged bewildered looks. "What do you mean exactly?" he asked thoughtfully. I took a business card out of the folder in front of me and slid it across the polished mahogany instead of responding directly. The Chief Executive Officer, Elizabeth A. Windsor, was the only name printed on the embossed cream cardstock, along with the emblem of Monarch Holdings. Oliver picked up the card and looked at it with increasing bewilderment. "You've already mentioned Elizabeth Windsor. How are you involved in this?" "My middle name is Elizabeth," I muttered. "One of my maiden names is Windsor." Oliver's cheeks drained of blood as understanding set in. "That isn't conceivable, is it?" "Very likely," Jonathan said, slipping a document in each man's direction. "These incorporation documents unequivocally show that Amelia Elizabeth Blackwood, previously Windsor, is the only owner and controller of Monarch Holdings." With increasingly desperate motions, Henderson grabbed the document and began to scan it. "This isn't allowed." On the part of Monarch, the valuation procedure and the talks were carried out in complete transparency. Jonathan completed without incident. "Mrs. Blackwood is barely accountable if Mr. Blackwood decided not to do a comprehensive investigation of the purchasing company." Oliver stayed motionless, the business card still clenched in his fingers as though it may change into something less reproachable. You've been in charge of this whole thing? The negotiations, the emails, the conference calls? Were carried out in accordance with my specific directives and by authorized representatives of Monarch Holdings, I attested. Why? Oliver seemed to have been split by the one word, which was rife with confusion and betrayal. Why would you do this? I was about to respond when the door to the boardroom opened again and Marcus Torres entered, accompanied by a distinguished man in his 60s whom I knew to be Harold Westfield, the board member Oliver had been relying on to back whatever emergency measures he had in mind. Mrs. Blackwood gave me a startled greeting. "Seeing you here this morning surprised me." "That seems to be the general consensus," I said, grinning a little. However, I felt my appearance was appropriate as Bradford Precision Technologies' new owner. Westfield raised his eyebrows. "Please forgive me. She says that Monarch Holdings is her idea." Oliver eventually found his voice and interrupted. "It's ridiculous. A miscommunication, or worse, Mercer's manipulation. It's neither ludicrous nor deceptive." Anger hardening his normally polite tone, Marcus interrupted. "Before we continue, there is more that all of you need to know." With careful attention, he set a flash drive on the table. "This includes proof of a deliberate attempt to steal intellectual property yesterday, carried out at Oliver's express direction. Had we obeyed? Before today's ownership transfer was finalized, Bradford's most valuable assets would have been moved to an outside server under his direct control." Oliver jumped up and down. "That is untrue. The transfers followed the usual security procedure for what purpose?" Quietly, I asked. "For making certain that you would keep ownership of the patents and designs that give a devalued business its true worth after selling it to Monarch Holdings. During talks, Did you submit valuation documentation that did not include the patents and designs in question? There was complete stillness after that. As the ramifications became apparent, Henderson and Patterson gazed at Oliver in a growing sense of terror. Westfield's face had changed from bewilderment to icy evaluation. Maybe, Jonathan said into the silence, we ought to go over all of the financial data before the entire board shows up at 10. Before Mrs. Blackwood announces some very important organizational adjustments, it would be beneficial to handle some inconsistencies in private. Oliver turned from one person to another, looking for an ally but finding none. His residual serenity was ultimately broken by whatever he saw in my face. He snarled, fumbling with his supplies, "You have no idea what you've done. I have made agreements that cannot be revoked by corporate wrangling, and this company has liabilities you are unaware of." "Actually, I know exactly what I've done," I said, steadfastly looking into his eyes. "The issue is whether you're ready to accept the consequences of your actions. Because that reckoning starts today, Oliver, in one way or another." With corporate ceremonial precision, 10 o'clock arrived. One by one, board members walked into the room, their faces changing from ones of professional neutrality to ones of hardly disguised amazement that I was sitting in Richard's chair. Oliver had withdrawn to the far corner, where he and Henderson had been having a heated, whispered discussion that ended abruptly when the meeting was called to order by the company's secretary. "This is our first formal meeting since Chairman Richard Blackwood's death," the secretary said. "I want to start by expressing my condolences to Mrs. Blackwood and Oliver, who are both here today, and acknowledging our shared sorrow." Around the table, there were murmurs of agreement. I acknowledged the bewilderment on multiple faces with a polite nod. It was the first time I attended a board meeting. I had kept the appropriate distance as a business wife for all the years Richard had been the company's leader, only going to social gatherings and charitable activities. The secretary went on to say that the introduction of new ownership after the sale to Monarch Holdings is our main agenda item for today. This transition plan will be presented by Oliver Blackwood, and then... Well? Jonathan's interjection was fluid. "A minor modification has been made to the program. The presentation will be given by Mrs. Blackwood." There were bewildered murmurs in the audience when the principal of Monarch Holdings spoke. Remained motionless, his face unreadable, as Henderson and Patterson looked at each other in horror. With differing degrees of perplexity and interest, the other 7 board members, 7 eminent people who had led Bradford Precision with Richard for years, turned to me. Drawing on Richard's recollection and my own long-suppressed powers, I gently stood up. "I appreciate everyone's presence today. Most of you will be surprised by what I'm about to reveal, but some of you have previously received briefings on some of the details." I looked around the room, briefly meeting each person's eyes. "After my husband's burial, my son told me 3 days later that Bradford Precision Technologies had been sold to Monarch Holdings for $13 million. $10,000 was my part of that sale." Murmurs and gasps echoed around the room. Oliver's jaw noticeably tensed as many board members turned to look at him. Calmly, I went on, "This sum was a major undervaluation of the business. Having worked with Richard for decades in ways that most of you couldn't see, I was well aware of this reality." I signaled to Jonathan, who gave each board member a packet. "What you're getting is a thorough analysis of Bradford Precision's true financial situation in comparison to the inflated valuation that was given to Monarch Holdings during the negotiating process. Additionally, there is evidence of consistent financial irregularities over the last 3 years, such as money being misappropriated, contracts being misrepresented, and, most recently, an attempt to seize the company's intellectual property prior to today's ownership transfer." The silence was broken by the rustle of papers as the board members started looking over the evidence. Oliver's composed exterior suddenly broke as he pulled free from the wall. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice tense with repressed rage. "It makes sense that my mother is upset about my father's passing. Mercer is trying to steer her in a wrong direction. Maybe you could explain why the pension fund has a $4 million mismatch or why the McNally defense contract is shown here at $7 million but the board approved it at $12, Westfield said, gazing up from the documents with a confused face. Only those who were attentively observing could see Oliver's brief stumbling. For those apparent differences, there are valid accounting reasons. I repeated quietly, ambush, an intriguing word choice from someone who offered his mother a $10,000 payout for her life's work, if we could discuss this privately rather than ambush me in front of. The room became quiet once more. I proceeded with meticulous attention to detail. You may not be aware, but I created Monarch Holdings 6 months ago under my maiden name, Elizabeth Windsor. When Richard first began to suspect financial problems, he was too sick to conduct a full investigation, so he suggested the creation of the corporation. I pulled another file out of my folder. This certified copy of Monarch Holdings Incorporation documents demonstrates my status as the company's sole proprietor and director. Bradford Precision Technologies, which my son thought he was selling to an unidentified investment firm, has been lawfully bought by me through this corporation. The ensuing hush was deep. Board members' faces ranged from amazement to dawning comprehension as they glanced between Oliver and me. Henderson had turned pale, and Patterson appeared to be planning ways out. The silence was finally broken by Oliver, who said in a sharp voice, "Mother, congrats on your corporate espionage. Dad would undoubtedly be pleased with your deceit." I let the word linger in the air and repeated it. "Deception," I told them. "Oliver, let's talk about deception. Let's talk about the patents you transferred to shell corporations you personally own and the offshore accounts you set up to get kickbacks from suppliers. You have been steadily depleting the pension fund to compensate for losses on your personal investments." Oliver's face hardened with each accusation, but he did not try to refute the accusations. Like onlookers at an especially cruel tennis match, the board members' focus shifted between us. "You have no proof," he said at last, but his voice seemed unconvinced. Quietly seated at the end of the table, Marcus Torres cleared his throat. "We do, in fact." He tapped the flash drive that was now attached to the projection system in the boardroom. "Server logs, email trails, and financial transfers. Months ago, Richard had a hunch that something was amiss. And, without your knowing, put further security measures into place." Oliver's gaze expanded. "Dad was confused and dying. Whatever you believe you possess was painstakingly recorded by a guy whose mind was sharp as a razor till the end of his life." I was done. Oliver, his body, not his mind, was impacted by the stroke. "He observed your actions. He simply couldn't face you head-on." Uncertainty flashed on my son's face for the first time. "You ought to have approached me immediately if you were worried. This intricate charade. Would you have paid attention? I just asked. Would you have given a reason for your attempt to deprive your mother of her just desserts? Why you were willing to liquidate my house and put me to a Charlotte-assisted care facility? Why did you violate not only your father's confidence but also the safety of all the workers who had faith in this business?" Oliver's eyes wandered calculatingly around the room, without answering the queries. Westfield leaned forward, his face solemn as he evaluated possible allies and found none. "Even though these accusations are quite concerning, I have to ask, what are your plans for the company going forward? Bradford Precision has more than 300 employees. There are commitments to meet and contracts to complete." I had been expecting that question. Pragmatic, less concerned with family drama and more with corporate continuity. Richard, the board member I had most regarded, did exactly what I would have expected. "I intend to proceed as usual. Bradford Precision will continue to operate as usual. All current agreements will be upheld. The pension fund will instantly return to full solvency." I stopped and looked at each board member in turn. "And starting today, there will be a major revision to the organizational structure." There was no humor in Oliver's laugh. "I'll guess. Am I fired?" I admitted that would be the most straightforward option, but it would not be the best one for the business or its workers. Oliver's demeanor shifted from scorn to confusion. This measured approach obviously wasn't what he had anticipated: public humiliation, instant termination, or possibly even criminal prosecution. I went on to say that I think the board should consider all available information before making any personnel choices. You'll discover some uncomfortable things. Some may be illegal. All of this necessitates giving our ethical and legal responsibilities considerable thought. Jonathan stood up as I gave him a nod. For each board member to peruse in private, we have prepared separate briefings. To give everyone time to comprehend this information, I propose that we take a 90-minute break. Mrs. Blackwood will offer her suggested restructuring plan when we get back together. Oliver stayed put while board members filed out, gripping their folders with looks ranging from disbelief to grim resolve. He finally spoke when Jonathan, Marcus, and I were the only people left in the room. "Mother, what game are you playing?" His voice was low and menacing. "Why this performance if you meant to ruin me? Why not just give the police a call?" I looked at my son's face. It was similar to Richard's but strangely more difficult. The intelligence focused on self-interest rather than creation, the ambition that had turned into avarice. My heart hurt for the youngster he had been and the man he had not been, in spite of everything. "Because I responded in a peaceful manner in spite of what you did. I still consider you my son. And your father's legacy continues to this day in this business. Oliver, I'm giving you one opportunity. One chance to do this right." A mixture of calculation and what could have been regret crossed his face. I couldn't be sure I'd seen it at all because it was so fleeting. He asked warily, "What exactly are you proposing?" "That's what we'll talk about when the board gets back together," I said, gathering my supplies. "Since nothing will be the same after today, I advise you to spend these 90 minutes thinking about what is most important to you." I could feel Richard's absence weighing heavily on me as I walked out of the boardroom. He ought to have been present to see what we had created together protected. Somehow, though, I felt Richard's presence enduring via the ideals he had ingrained in all of us, in Jonathan's quiet competence, in Marcus's resolute set of shoulders as he protected the delicate materials, and in my own surprising strength. The business would endure. Whether my relationship with my son could do the same was the only question that remained. A panoramic view of the city Richard had loved, with its skyscrapers a tribute to the ambition and industry he had personified, was available from the executive lounge on the 14th level. As Jonathan went over the reorganization proposal one last time, I stood at the window with my teacup cooling in my hands. Although the board could be concerned about the percentage distribution, he certified that the employee stock ownership plan is legally solid. 30% is a very generous amount. As I watched clouds create shifting shadows across the cityscape, I answered, "That's what Richard wanted." He felt that the individuals who founded this business ought to have a stake in it. Jonathan made a final note and nodded. "What about Oliver?" I have been struggling with this question ever since I learned of my son's treachery. Even now, the mother in me still wanted to keep him safe. The harm he had caused was too great for the businesswoman to overlook. The widow felt compelled to uphold Richard's moral legacy. Finally, I said, "The terms remain as discussed. He can choose to accept them or confront the options." Before Marcus entered, there was a soft knock. "Mrs. Blackwood, the board members are heading back to the conference room." And, with unusual hesitancy, he hesitated. And I asked, "Before the session starts up again, Oliver would like to talk to you in private." Jonathan and I looked at each other, his face carefully neutral. I asked for professional counsel. He said, "As your lawyer, would advise against any conversation without witnesses." He sighed as a 40-year buddy of Richard's. "There are some issues that go beyond legal caution." I gave a nod. 10 minutes. Not at his office, but here. And if we're not done by the time the board is ready, you'll interrupt. While Jonathan collected his supplies, Marcus went off to communicate my terms. "Amelia, are you sure about this?" "No," I said. "However, it might be our final chance for candor before things become irreconcilable." When Jonathan left, I stayed at the window, looking not at the door but at the city. I didn't see Oliver enter when it did open, but I could feel it, a change in the air, the faint smell of the cologne Richard had given him for Christmas. "Mom." There was none of the haughtiness in his speech. "I appreciate you agreeing to see me." I looked at my son and was amazed at how exhausted he seemed. The gleaming business exterior had given way to the stress underneath. I briefly saw the youngster who had earlier approached me for consolation and repair with shattered toys and injured knees. I said, neither accusing nor forgiving, 10 minutes isn't long to explain years of deception. Oliver kept his distance from us by moving to the other side of the room. I'm not here to defend my actions. The evidence is extensive. So why have you come here? My heart ached as he ran a hand through his hair, a motion that was so similar to Richard's. To comprehend the subsequent events. The documents that could land me in jail are being reviewed by the board. My reputation, my career. He stumbled. Everything I've constructed is in jeopardy. I made gentle corrections to everything we built. Oliver, you weren't the only one who started this business. It was the labor of your father's life. It provided for hundreds of households. It produced parts that enable airplanes to fly safely. It was never intended to serve as your own treasure trove. He recoiled like though I had hit him. Now I am aware of that. Do you? I looked closely at him. Or are you just sorry you were apprehended? His eyes flickered with anger, then faded into something more nuanced. With surprising candor, he acknowledged both. I apologize for getting caught. I apologize for betraying Dad's confidence. I apologize for treating you more like an afterthought than a collaborator in all that this business accomplished. His tone seemed empty, like the practiced repentance of a man who weighs his alternatives instead of facing his shortcomings, even though the words were correct. You have a choice with the plan I'm presenting to the board, I added. To undo the harm you've created, you can continue to work for Bradford Precision in a non-executive role while being closely monitored. Alternatively, you can step down entirely, subject to any legal repercussions the board deems suitable. Oliver's face became tense. Lack of managerial ability? I'm being demoted from CEO to what? A role in middle management? After working with Dad to establish this business for 15 years? In addition to? I repeated. Do you recall it that way? Since the financial documents present a different picture. They exhibit a consistent pattern of enriching themselves at the expense of the business. They demonstrate choices that put your own benefit ahead of the safety of your employees and the stability of the company. He objected to my 30% profit increase. I interrupted you on the McNally deal alone, the McNally contract from which you stole $5 million. He fell silent on the same contract whose true value you misled to the board. He could see the calculating behind his gaze. What would this non-executive role involve specifically? I answered, 1 year working in production. Gaining knowledge of how executive actions affect the individuals who actually construct our products. A potential job in operations management may follow, contingent on performance review and proven moral acumen. Manufacturing? Calculation gave way to incredulity. Do you think I'll be working on the manufacturing floor? Given my credentials? My encounter? I pointed out that the corporation hasn't benefited much from your corporate finance experience. Perhaps gaining practical experience with the actual work that brings in our money might offer insightful insight. Oliver paced the window's length, his agitation palpable in each step. This isn't professional growth, it's punishment. You're making fun of me to appease some people. I strongly corrected, I'm offering you redemption. A chance to learn this company from the ground up, just like your father did. Remember how Richard began working on the production line during breaks from college? He thought that without knowing every facet of the operation, no one could lead successfully. It was a different time period. Oliver brushed it off. My patience was finally wearing thin when I interjected, it seems that modern executives don't need ethics either. Or regard for the well-being of employees. Or basic human decency toward their mothers who have been widowed. He was silenced by the abrasiveness of my voice. We looked at one another for a number of extended moments over a distance that was much greater than the actual distance between us. The substitute? At last, he inquired. Resignation without delay. Complete reporting of financial irregularities to the appropriate authorities. Possible criminal accusations. Depending on the board's prosecutorial determination. There was no humor in Oliver's laugh. A few options. I whispered to him, more than you gave me. Wasn't it $10,000 and a care facility in Charlotte? The reminder struck like a blow to the body. His face flashed with real shame for the first time. I never imagined you would learn. I didn't mean that to sound so bad. It's just as awful as it sounds, I said. Oliver, you were throwing me away. You were willing to leave me to strangers 6 hours away with only enough money to cover necessities, despite everything your father and I gave up to give you advantages we never had, the best schools, connections, and possibilities. His eyes fell to the carpet, and he had no response. I went on, the board reconvenes in 2 minutes. I need your choice. Resignation and its repercussions, or redemption via honest labor. Incredulous, he continued, you're really going through with this. Reorganizing the business, giving workers stock, and promoting your own son to factory worker. I clarified that I'm doing what your father requested. The plans we talked about in his last months, when he understood what was going on but was unable to face you head on. Oliver jerked his head up. Did Dad know? Prior to the stroke? I explained that he suspected. It was impossible to overlook the financial disparities. He planned to discuss it with you in secret while he gathered evidence. Before he could, the stroke struck. The expression on Oliver's face changed. The knowledge that his father had passed away with knowledge of his treachery, and that their last discussions had been tainted by implicit awareness of his dishonesty. I softly said, 1 minute, Oliver. What have you decided? In a self-soothing and protective gesture, he straightened and adjusted his tie. Under objection, he responded stiffly, I'll take the production position. I said, noted, without sounding triumphant or relieved. This was not a win. Damage control was the goal. For Oliver himself, for our family, and for the business. As we made our way to the boardroom in silence, I couldn't help but think of Oliver's 5th birthday celebration. Richard had constructed a tiny workstation for him, complete with kid-sized instruments that were safe for tiny hands. My husband had declared with pride, he'll learn to build before he learns to direct others. The Bradford way is that. The lesson had been forgotten somewhere along the path. Relearning it might still be possible. When we walked in, the board members were seated, their faces solemn after going over the information. I sat at the head of the table, knowing full well that the next few minutes would decide not just the destiny of Bradford Precision but also the future of our family. I started, ladies and gentlemen, my voice calm as the emotion threatened to overpower me. We appreciate your patience during this challenging procedure. With immediate effect, I am now ready to deliver my suggested restructuring strategy for Bradford Precision Technologies. Oliver sat down, physically representing the change in status he had just accepted, but not at my right hand as he always did. The strain in his shoulders revealed his inner anguish, but his demeanor stayed carefully neutral. The financial remediation strategy, the management restructure, and the employee stock ownership program were all discussed as I laid out the proposal. I observed the board members' responses change from doubt to cautious acceptance. I maintained a matter-of-fact tone throughout the part about Oliver's new role, portraying it as a logical progression rather than the personal reckoning it actually was. I closed by saying that, subject to board approval, Marcus Torres will be promoted to Chief Executive Officer and I will take over as Chairwoman of Bradford Precision Technologies with immediate effect. There were murmurs of agreement with the recommendation. Marcus had gained respect from everyone in the organization for his honesty and technological know-how. He was famously loyal to Richard. I went on to say that this reorganization, which looks at each board member individually, is not only a reaction to the recent events but also a return to the values that Bradford Precision was established on: innovation, honesty, and human capital. My husband would have approved of it. This business is deserving of it. I felt Richard's presence more vividly than ever as the board approved the idea with a unanimous vote. It wasn't a paranormal apparition, but rather the living upholding of his principles via the organization he established and the individuals he impacted, possibly including the son who had momentarily lost his course. It was unclear if Oliver would be able to find his way back. But he had made the first move, at least today. At 6 a.m, Oliver started his first day on the manufacturing floor. 3 weeks following the board meeting, on a Monday morning, at m. From the window of my office, I observed him bring his opulent automobile into the staff parking lot, a striking contrast to the more modest cars that surrounded it. He sat there, and even from 15 stories up I could feel his hesitation. He turned off the engine, gathered his courage, and then stepped out wearing the dark blue coveralls that had been brought to his apartment the day before. Every industrial worker has the same problem. There are no exceptions. Marcus saw him arrive and join me at the window. Not that I was totally sure he would. I said, "He's a Blackwood." Regardless of his shortcomings, he was brought up to deal with the fallout. Marcus gave a contemplative nod. His supervisor will be Frank Donovan. Started the same year as Richard and has been with the company for 27 years. He is aware of the circumstances. What about his directives? Just like you said. No preferential or unfavorable treatment. Oliver works the same hours, abides by the same regulations, and fulfills the same requirements as any new employee. I saw my son approach the entrance to the industrial site, his ordinarily assured gait notably muted. I'm grateful for everything, Marcus. To most of us, Richard was more than a boss, he said plainly. The goal here is to preserve what he created. Marcus left, but I stayed by the window. Thinking back to Richard's early days of starting the business, how he would return home worn out, hands rough and often hurt, but eyes bright with the satisfaction of concrete accomplishment. He had frequently said, "There's something honest about physical work. Spreadsheets and presentations cannot be used as a shield. The component is either functional or non-functional." Hopefully, it wouldn't be too late for our son to learn that lesson now. As I adapted to my new role as chairwoman, the following 3 weeks flew by. The financial remediation strategy was going well, diverted contract funds had been returned to their rightful accounts, and the pension fund had been fully restored. The revelation of employee equity ownership had been greeted by astonished shock, followed by sincere excitement, especially from long-term employees. Who, like the business, had survived economic downturns. Oliver's name was conspicuously missing from these conversations. Instead of publicly naming him as the culprit, the board had agreed to blame the financial anomalies to accounting mistakes. Although theoretically correct, his new role was offered as a component of a management development program that prioritized thorough operational expertise. Since Oliver's first day on the floor, I hadn't had a direct conversation with him. Frank Donovan's frequent reports depicted reluctant compliance. He was on time. Finished the work at hand with little interaction with others, and left right away as the shift ended. His attitude was only passable, but his technical proficiency was sufficient. Choosing to walk the tightrope between disobedience and perfection, neither the best nor the worst new hire. Frank asked for a meeting on the afternoon of the third Friday. The seasoned production manager's enormous hands, which dwarfed the fragile teacup I presented, gave the impression that he was uneasy in the executive suite. He sat down awkwardly in the visitor's chair and said, "Mrs. Blackwood. As directed, I have been keeping an eye on your youngster. Just like every other new hire, no preferential treatment." "Thank you, Frank. Has something gone wrong?" He moved, obviously considering what he was saying. "Not a huge issue. One more thing to note. Oliver finished his foundational training modules more quickly than most. Although he has good technical knowledge, he has entirely cut himself off from the team." "Willfully?" "Hard to say." Frank scratched at his chin, which was studded with silver. "It might be conceit. It might be humiliation. In any case, he is overlooking the most crucial aspect of floor work, the group problem-solving and knowledge-sharing that training manuals are unable to convey." I nodded, instantly understanding. Richard had always underlined that the real competitive advantage of Bradford was not its machinery or even its designs, but rather the combined knowledge of staff members who had collaborated for decades, passing along knowledge and insights from one generation to the next. "What would you recommend?" I inquired. "Typically, I would assign a veteran team member to mentor a struggling new hire." Frank paused. "But it's complicated because of who you are and who he is. Even if the boss's son needs a lesson, no one wants to be the one giving it to him." A grudging smile pinched Frank's old cheeks. "Particularly then, ma'am, I thought about the problem. Oliver didn't need to remain isolated, he needed to be truly integrated into the production team. But there was an unavoidable hurdle because he was the son of the current chairman and previous CEO. On the floor, who is your best mentor? Someone who has the self-assurance to treat Oliver like any other new employee, regardless of his last name, is what I asked. Without hesitation, Frank said, that would be Elena Vasquez. Our precision assembly crew is led by a 23-year veteran who had direct training from Richard when he was still occasionally working the line. I smiled as I recalled Elena, the feisty young lady who had gone to corporate picnics with her expanding family throughout the years. She always had the best hands in the business, according to Richard. It still does. Frank was clearly respectful. She also doesn't put up with idiots, no matter their rank or kinship. Excellent. Complete the job with my complete assistance. I added, and Frank, as he got up to go. I appreciate your careful handling of this matter. You were really important to Richard. The supervisor's grizzled neck began to flush. He was a decent man. Ma'am, we all want to see her business succeed. Even if that means some people may have to go through some challenging changes. I found myself looking at the family photo on my desk after Frank left. 17 years ago, Richard, Oliver, and I attended Oliver's college graduation. We were all grinning and full of hope for the future. Richard's pride was visible in every line of his face as he put his arm around our son's shoulders. How would he feel about the state of affairs now? His wife is in his chair, his son has been banished to the production floor, and his business is still healing from the nearly disastrous betrayal by the person he had trained to be his successor. As I drove home that night, the question continued to nag at me. Instead of heading for the house where Richard and I had shared decades of life, I ended up taking a well-traveled path to Oliver's apartment complex in the heart of the city. Although it wasn't planned, the choice felt essential once it was made. The concierge knew who I was right away. It's been far too long, Mrs. Blackwood. Should I tell Mr. Blackwood about you? No, James, thank you. I would rather surprise him. I braced myself for possible animosity in the elevator that led up to the apartment Oliver had bought following his divorce 3 years prior. Since the board meeting, we hadn't had a private conversation. We only interacted in official business settings where professional etiquette was expected. Oliver's visage briefly registered surprise when he opened the door, but then it returned to a guarded neutrality. The business suit he had been wearing for years was no longer there. His new Rolls production coveralls were also gone. Rather, he donned a faded Harvard Business School t-shirt and faded pants that gave him a more vulnerable, youthful appearance. Mother, he said, moving aside to let me in. This is not what was intended. Oliver's public image was mirrored in the flat, which was sleek, contemporary, and flawlessly decorated. With minimal indications of sentiment or personal history. Despite its obvious value, the artwork was chosen for its investment possibilities rather than its emotional appeal. There were no family photos on the walls or other surfaces. I declined his move toward the minimalist sofa and added, I spoke with Frank Donovan today. He claims that you are meeting the technical requirements to a sufficient degree. There was no humor in Oliver's laugh. Excellent compliment, indeed. Enough. Dad would undoubtedly be overjoyed to see that evaluation of his son's potential. You've distanced yourself from the team, Frank added. I went on, disregarding the jab, to say that you're lacking the teamwork that is crucial to the position. Oliver answered, the team doesn't want anything to do with me. He walked over to the windows that looked out over the city from floor to ceiling. They are well aware of my identity and purpose. At his mother's request, the disgraced former CEO was making penance. Is that your perspective? Penance? With weariness visible in the shadows under his eyes, he turned to me. What do you call it? As I clock in using the time cards I used to sign paychecks against, I'm putting together the parts one used to approve budgets. It's humiliation out of a textbook. Or, I said gently, education. Your father always wanted you to see things this way. Dad has been absent for several months. Oliver lost his temper. When he isn't present to verify your wishes, you can't say you're fulfilling them. He verified them prior to the stroke, I answered, remaining composed in spite of his animosity. We talked about what was going on with the business, what you were doing, and how to deal with it for hours. Oliver's eyes flashed something. Maybe it was pain, or the knowledge that his father had been aware of his treachery. So he came up with the notion for this production floor assignment? The overall idea was, and I'm the one who implemented it specifically. I approach him, bridging the emotional and physical gap. This isn't about punishment, Oliver. It's about getting back in touch with the essence of Bradford Precision's work. Produces aircraft parts, he said sarcastically. I know. No, I made the correction. Safety is built by Bradford Precision. Human lives are ultimately at stake in every piece that leaves our production floor. Even after the company grew too big for him to know every employee by name, your father never forgot that. Oliver relaxed his protective stance for a second. We don't just build parts, we build trust, he used to say. That's right. I took advantage of our conversation's first real connection. You will begin working on precision assembly with Elena Vasquez on Monday. Your father trained her. No one else on the floor is as knowledgeable about our main items as she is. His demeanor returned to one of weariness. Your concept? Or Frank's? A compromise. Elena is not intimidated by your past and is confident enough to mentor you. She will teach you things that technical manuals cannot teach you. Oliver said, if she's willing to teach me at all. The majority of the floor crew hardly even acknowledge me. I pointed out that they're following your example. Oliver, isolation has reciprocal effects. They respect the fences you've created, not the other way around. This insight elicited no immediate reaction from him. In the quiet that ensued, I examined my son's face, looking for signs of the gregarious, active boy he used to be. With wide-eyed curiosity, the child had followed Richard about the original plant, asking incessant questions about how things operated and the rationale behind decisions. Finally, I said, I should leave. I wanted to personally inform you about the new assignment. Elena is deserving of your undivided attention. She embodies all that your father cherished about our workforce. Oliver's voice interrupted me as I was about to walk away. The scheme for employee stocks. Did Dad also think of that? I gave a nod. One that he had thought about for years but never put into practice. It never seemed to be the proper moment. So far. Oliver noted how it perfectly balances out everything I'd been doing up to this point. In honoring those who stayed faithful when their pension fund was being depleted to compensate your financial losses, I concurred. The overt allusion to his financial shenanigans struck like a punch to the gut. Oliver winced, then gave a barely noticeable nod. Elena and I will collaborate. Find out what she can teach you. There was no apology. It was not even an admission of guilt. However, it was acceptance of the future course. Real, maybe, but grudging. I pondered whether this brittle bond may grow stronger with time as I made my way home in the encroaching darkness. Whether the layers of ambition and entitlement that had taken my son so far away were still available. Perhaps Richard may leave behind a redeemed heir in addition to a successful business. Time would tell. For the time being, it was sufficient that Oliver would arrive on Monday, prepared to absorb knowledge from Elena Vasquez's deft hands and unwavering standards. It was just the start. It was a start, no matter how modest or hesitant. The center of Bradford Precision's production plant was Elena Vasquez's realm, a climate-controlled space where, under her strict supervision, the company's most advanced components were finalized. I watched, purposefully unannounced, from the manager's walkway above, as Oliver arrived for his first day of training in precision assembly. When my kid came to her workstation, Elena, a small woman with black hair streaked with silver and tucked into a handy bun, didn't look up from the calibration she was doing. Her magnifying eyes were fixed solely on the delicate gyroscopic component beneath her deft fingers, and her reading glasses rested low on her nose. She nodded without turning her head. You're 3 minutes ahead of schedule. Excellent. When components for flying systems must be delivered according to precise specifications, punctuality is crucial. Oliver stood clumsily, obviously not understanding the formality. When he appeared, assistants in the executive suite sprung to attention. Right here. Elena carried on making her careful modifications as though the former CEO's presence had never been noticed. When Frank Donovan eventually offered, he added, "I should report to you for precision assembly training." Elena tested the movement of the component, made one more adjustment, recorded the calibration in a digital system, and then looked up at my son. Nothing beyond professional judgment could be read in her expression. She said matter-of-factly, "Your father could assemble this unit in 17 minutes. He said that his piano player's fingers were the reason he had never broken his personal record, not even by me." Oliver looked down at his own hands, which were the same size and shape as Richard's, but without the calluses my husband had proudly worn. "I had no idea that he continued to work on the floor after he was promoted to CEO. At least once a month," Elena said, taking off her glasses. Claimed that it kept him grounded in reality and honest. She pointed to the stool next to her desk. "Today, you will observe. You will try basic assembly under supervision tomorrow. You ought to be allowed to work independently on non-essential components by Friday." Oliver appeared surprised by the clinical effectiveness of her idea. "Like that? Am I eligible by Friday?" Elena's brows went up a bit. She met the requirements for Level 1 assembly. To become certified for flight-critical components, you must pass 7 levels. Following the Martin incident in 1997, your father himself put the system into place. "The event involving Martin?" Oliver reiterated, clearly bewildered. Elena retorted, "Before your time. If you want to know, ask your mother. For now, keep a tight eye on things. These elements must always be executed flawlessly." I watched from a distance as Elena started to carefully walk through the precise assembly procedure, her movements deliberate and well-practiced. Oliver observed with growing interest, occasionally posing queries that Elena addressed bluntly but succinctly. As the intricacy of the task became clear, the initial discomfort gradually gave way to concentrated engagement. Satisfied that Elena would give Oliver exactly what he needed, not pity or harsh criticism, but simple competence and institutional knowledge untarnished by family dynamics, I slipped away before either of them realized I was there. Subtle but discernible changes occurred over the next 2 weeks. Technical performance was getting better, according to Frank's daily reports. More importantly, Oliver had started showing up 15 minutes prior to his shift in order to go over the quality control measures from the day before. Richard had long advocated for serious production workers to follow this method. Marcus dropped by my office on the 3rd week's Wednesday with a surprising news. He pulled up security footage from yesterday's afternoon break on his tablet and said, "You might want to see this." Oliver was seen on camera sitting by himself at a corner table in the staff break area, going over paperwork while he ate. Elena and a few other senior production staff members went in, took a seat at a neighboring table, and got into what seemed to be a heated argument over a technical specification. Oliver looked up after a few minutes, obviously hearing what they were talking about. He paused, then spoke, too softly for the security camera to pick up, but it was obvious that he was pointing at the paperwork. After giving his words some thought, Elena nodded and gestured for him to sit at their table. Marcus noted, "This is the first social integration we've seen. On the court, Elena's squad has a big impact. Others will follow if they embrace him. Acceptance in the workplace. It's not personal," I explained. "Based on skill rather than pity. Just the way you wanted it," Marcus said. "Richard would be pleased." Curious about this minor but important change, I drove to Oliver's apartment complex once more that evening. The concierge, who was now used to my sporadic surprise visits, waved me through without saying anything. The alterations were evident as soon as Oliver opened the door. The sharp executive who had lived here for years was no more. The man in front of me was dressed in faded trousers and a shirt bearing the production department emblem from Bradford Precision Company. His hands had the first signs of calluses, and despite clear efforts to clean them, there was still a speck of machine oil under one fingernail. "Mom." Twice in a single month, he greeted me with surprise but without any noticeable anger. "Do I need to worry?" I accepted his gesture toward the living room and said, "Just checking in. You're getting better, according to Frank and Elena." Oliver trailed me, his steps revealing the physical exhaustion of unfamiliar laborious effort. Today, I successfully completed the G47 stabilizer assembly and passed quality control's initial inspection. There was no mistaking the sound of pride in his voice, and it was well earned. With more than 60 precise pieces that needed to be perfectly aligned, the G47 was a notoriously complicated component. I admitted that was outstanding for someone who had only been on the floor for 3 weeks. Richard would be happy. Oliver nodded thoughtfully as he took this in. After talking about the Martin incident today, Elena stated Dad went ahead and put the 7-level certification system in place. I verified that he did, bringing back memories of that trying time. A military transport plane experienced a non-fatal incident due to a component failure. One misaligned element that passed quality control was identified as the cause of the issue by the investigation. Although there were no significant injuries, Richard took it personally. He spent a month developing the component and the certification procedure, according to Elena. Oliver added that until he figured things out, he slept on a cot in the engineering department. The memory made me grin. Every morning, I brought him fresh clothes. Until he had resolved the issue, not just the technological malfunction, but the system that made it possible, he would not return home. Oliver sat down on the sofa opposite me and said, I didn't see that in any of the company histories I read. Richard didn't want anyone to know. According to him, errors are to be learned from rather than remembered. For the first time in months, I looked at my son's face with true curiosity instead of defensiveness. Your father is the subject of numerous anecdotes that were never officially documented. However, the workers, particularly those who had direct contact with him, keep them alive. Oliver provided, just like Elena. When she speaks of him, she refers to him as Richard. Neither the CEO nor Mr. Blackwood. I mentioned that they began at Bradford within months of one another. Back then, she was among the first female producers. Richard saw her talent right away and gave her one-on-one mentoring. Their camaraderie went beyond the hierarchy. Oliver silently took everything in, his eyes straying to the city lights outside his windows. His voice was softer when he spoke again. I was unaware of that aspect of him. He was already chairman when I started working for the company. His clothing were immaculately pressed, and his hands were spotless. I never thought he would work on the manufacturing line or sleep on a cot. Beyond its straightforward language, the statement conveyed a sense of how little Oliver knew about the man whose business he had so casually ruined and how utterly he had overlooked the integrity and interpersonal relationships that Bradford Precision had been founded on. He wanted you to know that side of him, I added quietly. He required that you work in several departments during the summers while in college because of this. However, the executive suite always piqued your interest more than the manufacturing floor. This was not denied by Oliver. I could understand the numbers. Tidy, dependable, and in control. He flexed his hands, looking at the growing calluses with a mixture of discomfiture and curiosity, as if the human element were ineffective. I'm now discovering that people are more complicated than I thought. I can't even notice a misalignment, but Elena can. Somehow, she senses it more strongly than the gauges do. I pointed out that's experience. The kind that spreadsheets and quarterly reports are unable to measure. Indeed. Oliver's customary defensiveness was absent from his acknowledgement. I'm starting to see why Dad thought it was so important. The modest but important disclosure hovered between us like a flimsy bridge over the recent abyss. Perhaps the basis for reconciliation, even if it isn't realized yet, is a mutual understanding of Richard's principles. Oliver led me to the door as I was ready to go. According to Elena, next month marks the Employee Scholarship Program's 20th anniversary. Usually, there is a recognition event of some sort. Yes, I did confirm. Following the death of his father, Richard began it. Each year, 20 employees' children receive college scholarships. At the picnic in the summer, we introduced them. Oliver gave a contemplative nod. Is it appropriate for me to attend? Will you? He paused, trying to find the best way to characterize his current uncertain status in any formal capacity. I provided as a Bradford. Your father would want you there, of course. His expression changed to one of relief. Thank you. To learn more about what he constructed, I would like to see it. I thought about the small change in my son's viewpoint as I drove home through the peaceful streets. What years of executive direction had failed to achieve, 3 weeks on the production floor had. An overview of the human capital that underpins Bradford Precision's superior technical performance. The sincere satisfaction of putting a part together by hand. The acknowledgement of expertise that was not reducible to processes or algorithms. It wasn't atonement. Not quite yet. He was still working to repair the financial harm he had inflicted. He still had damaged the confidence he had betrayed with the board, the staff, and most severely, with me. However, tonight was the first time I had witnessed sincere inquiry take the place of guarded pride. Dismissive tolerance gave way to respect for Elena's knowledge. Richard had thought that when individuals were shown the repercussions of their behavior and given a way to improve, they could change. Bradford Precision's management techniques, quality control systems, and even employee disciplinary procedures were all infused with that attitude by him. Second opportunities, obtained by proving one's dedication to getting better. Maybe, one precise part at a time, our son would show him correct. Since the company's inception, Bradford Precision Technologies has had an annual summer picnic. It was founded by Richard during the company's first uncertain year, when workers put in months of overtime to finish a vital contract that kept the nascent business viable. As he grilled hamburgers for the 30 employees that made up the entire workforce at the time, he said, "We celebrate success together." 43 years later, more than 300 employees and their families were enjoying the catered barbecue game stations and live band as the event spread out into the event grounds of the neighborhood park. While parents and co-workers unwinded in the June sunshine, children hurried between activities. In the informal setting, the workplace hierarchy momentarily vanished. I came early to supervise the last-minute setup for the scholarship presentation, especially the exhibit with the old beneficiaries' photos. Several had returned to Bradford Precision as engineers, accountants, and managers, and many had gone on to have illustrious careers. One of Richard's greatest accomplishments was the program. An outward manifestation of his conviction that supporting the families of employees benefited the business as a whole. Mrs. Blackwood, Sandra from Human Resources, confirmed that everything is prepared. Pointing to the stage, where 20 envelopes were waiting to be presented. Upfront seating has been designated for the recipients and their families. Your folder now has Mr. Blackwood's regular speech notes together with the most recent data. I said, "Thank you, Sandra." However, I wasn't planning on using Richard's speech. Knowing that this year's presentation held special meaning being the first following his death, I had prepared my own, which was shorter but more sincere. I moved among the staff as they started to arrive, offering condolences and reminiscing about Richard. Oliver's noticeable absence from executive activities since the reorganization prompted many people to inquire about him, some out of genuine worry and others with hardly disguised curiosity. I kept bringing up the fact that he's getting useful production experience without hiding or overstating the importance of his new role. Richard has always supported thorough operational comprehension. The park was bustling with activity by midday. As I watched the entry, I wondered if Oliver would really show there. I purposely didn't remind him because he hadn't confirmed his appearance since our talk 3 weeks prior. This had to be his decision, not a requirement. It was at 12:30 that I saw him. Wearing a button-down shirt and casual slacks, he came by himself. Understated yet appropriate, he doesn't highlight his new producing role or try to recapture his executive identity. He stopped at the doorway, looking around the room with apparent nervousness, then he squared his shoulders and entered the room. His appearance had a minor but noticeable knock-on impact. There was a pause in conversation. They looked at each other. The background noise level decreased and then increased again. Oliver appeared to be aware of this response, yet he went on, acknowledging those who looked directly into his eyes with a nod. As he traversed this delicate social terrain, I observed from a distance. Some workers turned away on purpose. Others greeted cautiously. Richard was briefly conversed with by a handful, primarily long-time production employees who had known him personally. Then Elena showed up behind him and said something that suddenly made him laugh. She pointed to a table where a few of her Precision Assembly team members were seated, and Oliver moved to make place. Throughout the event, the most renowned production leader's public and intentional gesture of inclusion delivered a message all by itself. Marcus appeared next to me, watching me. "It was an interesting development," he said. "Elena doesn't make any motions that are symbolic. He must have earned it in some way if she is openly endorsing him." "Has he?" I inquired, sincerely interested in Marcus's opinion. "Word on the floor is that he has worked hard. No special treatment, no quick cuts. 2 weeks ahead of schedule, he finished the Level 3 certification last week." Marcus gave a shrug. He was never limited by technical skill. It was attitude. "And that's getting better?" Marcus qualified, at least, as evolving. Elena claims that rather than making statements, he now asks questions. Genuinely pays attention to the responses. Little steps, but the right ones. Sandra came up to remind me that the scholarship presentation would start in 15 minutes at 1 o'clock. I felt someone next to me as I went over my notes one more time, and when I looked up, I saw Oliver. I admitted that I wasn't sure you would show up. With his hands in his pockets in a manner evocative of his adolescence, he acknowledged that neither was I. However, Elena persuaded me that, regardless of other circumstances, Dad never missed this event. She is correct. For him, it was everything. "I'll be announcing this year's recipients shortly," I said after hesitating. "Do you want to go on stage with me?" I quickly explained that it was to assist in distributing the certificates, not to speak. "It's customary in the family." His expression changed from one of surprise to one of uncertainty. "Would that be suitable?" "You're still a Blackwood, considering my current position," I said plainly. "Richard's son, still. There are some things that go beyond organizational charts." He thought about it. Looking out at the assembling crowd. "Will it cause you to feel uncomfortable?" "These days, I'm not exactly well-liked." I told him I could handle it. "The question is, are you prepared to once more stand in public as a member of this legacy, not as CEO, but as family?" Oliver remained silent for a while as his eyes strayed to the exhibit of previous scholarship winners. "That's Lucas Donovan," he said, indicating a picture taken 7 years prior. "The son of Frank? Isn't he now an aeronautical engineer?" "Yes, I work in Houston for NASA." Elena's daughter, Maria Vasquez, is also graduating from medical school this year. As I saw him draw these links, I nodded. Maybe for the first time, he was able to observe how his father's ideas affected people rather than just their quarterly financial impact. Finally he said, "I'd want to take part. If you're positive it won't take away from the moment spent with the receiver." I greeted the gathered family and company as we stood together on the tiny stage 15 minutes later. The audience mused briefly when they saw Oliver standing next to me, but when I discussed Richard's idea for the scholarship program, everyone's focus swiftly shifted back to the event's goal. As I looked out at the eager faces, I remarked that my husband thought education was the best gift we could give the future generation. He wanted not only technical knowledge but also the wider understanding that comes from having access to school. He would say, "We're not just building parts. We are constructing futures." Oliver quietly congratulated each individual as I called them forward, handing them their diploma and scholarship information. The 18-year-olds, who were about to embark on their college careers, accepted with differing degrees of pride and anxiety. In their succinct acceptance speeches, many spoke of Richard's influence on their families. Sofia Ramirez, the daughter of Juan Ramirez, who had spent more than 20 years working in maintenance, was the last recipient. She turned to face Oliver as she took her certificate. She stated unequivocally, "Your father changed my dad's life by hiring him, and now this scholarship will change mine. For many more generations to come, I hope Bradford Precision will continue to support families like ours." The direct address appeared to startle Oliver for a time, but he soon got over it. "That's our goal," he said. "Sophia, congrats on your accomplishment. Seeing how far your hard work has brought you would have made my father very proud." Hundreds of people watched this simple transaction, which had significance beyond its politeness. Oliver had made a tiny but substantial step toward regaining his position in the Bradford tale by accepting both Richard's legacy and his own role in it, not out of entitlement but out of accountability. Elena came over to us at the edge of the stage after the ceremony was over and the audience had scattered off to resume the picnic activities. "Well done, both of you," she remarked bluntly, as usual. Richard would have been happy. I acknowledged her part in this tiny healing moment and responded, "Thank you for encouraging Oliver to attend." Elena gave a shrug. Bradford customs are important. The company's values endure even when people fail. She looked across at Oliver. "On Monday morning, you have a Level 4 certification test scheduled. Avoid being late. Stanley, who is in charge of the evaluation, is quite particular about being on time." She left with that useful reminder. As crews started taking down the stage setup, they left us alone. Oliver remarked sarcastically, "She doesn't believe in excessive praise." She wouldn't have brought up the certification, but I did agree. If she believed you weren't prepared. That's how she interprets encouragement. Dawning, Oliver nodded in understanding. The language is starting to come to me. Slowly. I admitted that it's a different dialect than the one used in the executive suite, but Richard spoke it well. He transitioned between realms with ease. As we made our way to the main picnic area, Oliver confessed, "I never managed that. Spreadsheets always felt more natural to me than shop banter." Perhaps that contributed to the issue. The admission hung between us, neither accepted nor rejected, and was possibly the closest he had come to addressing the underlying reasons for his unethical behavior. A move in the direction of self-awareness, but not quite an apology. Finally, I said, "Learning a new language is something you can do at any time. Up until the day of his death, your father held that belief." Oliver gave me a quick glance, his cautious poise giving way to something fragile. "If he had survived to witness what I did, do you think he would have forgiven me?" I was taken off guard by the question since it was so direct and essential to everything that had happened. I halted my pace and looked straight at my son. I said carefully that Richard believed in accountability. He would have demanded that you take responsibility, make amends, and show that you had truly changed. But in the end, I think he would have been able to forgive you. You never knew how much he loved you. Oliver gave a nod. His features tightened with emotion, then he regained composure. "Mother, I'm attempting to comprehend what he created and what I almost ruined. I'm trying, but I'm not sure whether I'll ever get it right." "I understand," I stated plainly. I watched my son traverse this difficult social landscape as we returned to the picnic, neither totally accepted as the manufacturing worker he was evolving into nor as the entitled CEO he had been. However, somewhere in the middle, a man in transition trying to forge a new course while confronting the repercussions of his actions, Richard would have applauded. Oliver's willingness to start the challenging process of redemption, to understand the language of individuals he had rejected and to see the human basis of the business he had almost destroyed out of mindless ambition, was what I thought about, not his betrayal. The faces of the scholarship awardees were filled with hope and promise as they gathered for a group shot. I was more aware of Richard's presence while I watched them than I had ever been since his passing, not in the form of sadness or absence, but rather as his enduring influence via the lives he had impacted and the principles he had set. Bradford, the precision would go on. The legacy would live on. And maybe, in ways neither of us could yet really comprehend, our son would discover his proper position within it, not via inheritance or entitlement, but rather via the hard-won realization that genuine leadership starts with service. At the scholarship ceremony, Oliver makes his first public moves toward atonement, and a tenuous new bond between mother and son starts to form. Has he really changed? Or is this just a short-term adjustment to his situation? And what part will he eventually play in the future of the business? Forgiveness and accountability are simply the beginning of this process.